There is a candle burning in the darkness. Its flame does not move. Outside, a blizzard is tearing across the Wyoming prairie with enough force to strip the bark from trees and bury a standing horse to its chest. The wind is screaming at 50 miles an hour, driving ice and snow horizontally through the black November night. It is the kind of storm that kills. It has killed before many times on this high and merciless ground. But the candle does not know this. It sits on the hard-packed earth floor of a narrow corridor, a sealed space between two walls of hand-laid stone. Its flame is a perfect golden teardrop, as still and steady as if it were painted there. It does not flicker. It does not tremble. It does not even lean. The air around it is so profoundly motionless that the flame might as well be encased in glass. A woman built this place. A 28-year-old widow with no training in masonry, no money, and no help. She built it with her bare hands from the stones that littered a barren plot of land, following the drawings of a dead man that the rest of the world had called a fool. 3 months ago, every soul in the settlement of Kettle Creek agreed on two things: that Bryony Ashwell was a woman destroyed by grief, and that the coming winter would finish what the grief had started. They were wrong about both. 3 months before the candle. 3 months before the stillness and the stone and the impossible warmth. There was a room that smelled of tobacco and tallow and the sour undertone of whiskey that had soaked into the floorboards over the course of a decade. The trading post of Harlan Crestwood. The only place in Kettle Creek, Wyoming territory where a person could buy nails or flour or false sympathy in roughly equal measure. Bryony Ashwell stood in the center of that room. She was 28 years old. She weighed 112 pounds. And she was listening to a man explain her future to her as though she were a child who had wandered too close to a creek bank. Harlan Crestwood sat behind his counter. A big man. Solid. The kind of solid that came from a lifetime of lifting crates and counting coins and believing absolutely in the rightness of his own opinions. He was 55 years old, and he had the face of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by anyone whose judgment he respected. Which meant he had never been told he was wrong at all. Because Harlan Crestwood did not respect the judgment of anyone who disagreed with him. It was a tidy little system, airtight, like his books. He was talking about the cellar. He had been talking about the cellar for 10 minutes now, describing it the way a man might describe a fine hotel suite, a room of her own, a cot for the boy, a stove that drew well barely smoked at all, warm in winter, cool in summer. All she had to do was the washing, the settlement's washing, sheets and shirts and stockings and whatever else the families of Kettle Creek saw fit to soil in the course of their daily lives. A simple arrangement, honest work for honest shelter. He said the word honest 3 times. Bryony counted. She also counted the men. There were 4 of them arranged around the store in postures of casual interest. the postmaster, the farrier, two cattlemen who had no business being inside on a Tuesday morning. They were there to watch, to witness the moment the widow Ashwell came to her senses and accepted the only offer that a woman in her position could reasonably accept. Because that was what widows did. They accepted things. They lowered their eyes and their expectations, and they found a corner to be useful in. Especially widows whose husbands had died leaving nothing behind but debt, and a reputation for eccentricity that bordered on outright madness. Callum Ashwell had been dead for 14 days. The fever had taken him in 3 days from the first shiver to the last breath. And in those 3 days, the whole architecture of Bryony's life had come apart. The man who had been the axis around which her entire world turned. The man whose hands could split a granite boulder along a seam so fine it was invisible to anyone else. The man who filled notebook after notebook with drawings she did not understand and ideas she could not follow but believed in with a faith so deep and unquestioning it frightened her sometimes. Gone, and in the vacuum he left behind. The town had rushed in, with casseroles and condolences and that particular brand of frontier pity that was really just a down payment on future control. They were kind. Of course they were kind. They brought bread. They brought soup. They brought unsolicited opinions about her future wrapped in the language of Christian charity. And now they had brought Harlan Crestwood's cellar. He finished his pitch, leaned back in his chair, folded his hands across his vest like a man who had just laid down a winning hand at poker. The silence stretched. Bryony looked at the floor, at the worn planks, at a knot in the wood that looked like a closed eye. She thought about the cellar. She thought about the dampness of it, the low ceiling, the single small window that would let in a rectangle of gray light for a few hours each day before plunging them back into permanent twilight. She thought about her son growing up in that twilight, learning to stoop, learning to be grateful, learning that his mother had surrendered everything his father had worked for in exchange for the privilege of washing other people's sheets. She thought about Callum and something in her chest, some small, stubborn ember that the grief had not quite managed to extinguish, flared. Number. The word came out of her mouth before she had fully decided to say it. Quiet. Final. Harlan blinked. The postmaster shifted his weight. One of the cattlemen coughed. "I beg your pardon," Harlan said. "No," Bryony said again. "I will not be taking the cellar. I am going to the land, Callum's land, the plot on the high prairie." And there it was, the thing she had been carrying inside her for 14 days, the decision that had been forming in the marrow of her bones, even as the rest of her was drowning in grief. She was going to the worthless piece of ground that her husband had purchased 6 months before his death. The barren, wind-scoured plot on the high prairie that had no timber, no water worth mentioning, nothing but stone and grass and a half-finished foundation that everyone in Kettle Creek pointed to as the final proof that Callum Ashwell had lost his mind. She was going there, and she was taking her son. The silence in the trading post was absolute. Harlan recovered first. He leaned forward. His voice dropped to the register men use when they believe they are delivering news that is both devastating and necessary. Mistress Ashwell, I understand that grief can cloud the judgment of even the steadiest mind, but I would be failing in my duty as a Christian man if I did not speak plainly. He paused. Let the weight of his plainness settle. Your husband, God rest him, was a good stonemason when he chose to be, but that land broke him. He spent every cent you had on it. He neglected paying work to sit out there on that empty ground, sketching in his little books like a man touched by fever. She said nothing, he continued. And now he has left you with nothing. Less than nothing, in fact. Harlan reached beneath his counter and produced a piece of paper, a contract. He laid it flat and turned it so she could read it. His thick finger pointed to a line of figures at the bottom. Your husband owed me $40 for materials, stone tools, iron fittings, blasting powder. He purchased them on credit 7 months ago for his little project out there on the prairie. Harlan's finger moved to another line. The terms are clear. Callum signed them himself. If the debt is not repaid within 90 days of default, I am within my legal right to claim the property as settlement. Bryony stared at the paper, at the numbers, at Callum's familiar angular signature at the bottom. $40. It might as well have been 40,000. She had $11.30 to her name, the sum total of everything her husband had left behind that could be converted to cash. 90 days. The clock had started ticking the day Callum died. She looked up at Harlan, and she saw something in his eyes that the careful mask of benevolent concern could not quite conceal. A glint, a calculation, the look of a man who has set a trap and is watching his prey walk toward it. He did not want to help her. He wanted the land. She did not know why. The land was worthless. Everyone said so. Callum himself had never been able to explain its value in terms that anyone else could understand. But Harlan wanted it. She could feel it the way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something about that barren plot of stone and wind was worth more than $40 to Harlan Crestwood. And his offer of the cellar, his performance of Christian charity. It was not rescue, it was strategy. Get the widow underground, get her dependent, get her grateful. And when the 90 days were up, take the land without a fight. I understand the terms, Bryony said. She picked up the contract, folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of her dress. I will repay the debt. Harlan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. With what, may I ask? I will find a way. She turned and walked out of the trading post. Past the postmaster, past the farrier, past the 2 cattlemen and their useless Tuesday morning curiosity. She walked out into the thin September sunlight and she did not look back. Behind her, she heard Harlan's voice, speaking to the men, the words carrying on the still air with the clarity of a church bell. "She will not last the first frost. Mark my words. We will find what is left of her in the spring." The wagon ride to the property took 4 hours. 4 hours of rutted track and prairie grass and a sky so vast it made Bryony feel like an insect crawling across a dinner plate. Rowan sat beside her, her son. 7 years old, his father's dark hair, his mother's gray eyes, a face that had not smiled in 14 days and seemed to have forgotten how. He did not ask where they were going. He knew. He had heard the conversations, the arguments, the whispered consultations between neighbors who thought he was too young to understand. He understood everything. Children always do. They may not have the words for it yet, but they understand. When they arrived, the desolation hit her like a closed fist. The land stretched flat and treeless in every direction, exposed to every wind that had ever blown since the beginning of the world. The grass was short and tough and the color of old rope. It hissed as the wind bent it low, a dry, papery sound like something dying slowly and without complaint. And in the center of it, the foundation, Callum's foundation, a rectangle of massive, expertly fitted stones, maybe 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, sunk into the earth with a precision that spoke of months of careful labor. It was the most beautiful piece of masonry Bryony had ever seen, and the most useless, because there was nothing on top of it. No walls, no roof, no shelter. Just a stone outline on a barren plain. The beginning of a sentence that would never be finished. She stared at it and felt the grief rise up in her chest like floodwater. This was Callum's dream. This perfect rectangle of stone. And it had died with him. Unfinished, unexplained, a monument to everything he had tried to be and everything the world had refused to let him become. She made camp beside the foundation, using the wagon as a windbreak and a canvas tarp as a roof. It snapped and popped in the ceaseless wind like a living thing trying to tear itself free. For 2 weeks, she survived. That was the only word for it. She cooked over a small fire that the wind tried to steal every single night. She hauled water from a seep spring 1/2 mile away. She cleared rocks and weeds from the foundation with no plan and no purpose. Just the desperate need to keep her hands busy so her mind would not eat her alive. Rowan helped when he could. He carried water in a tin bucket that was too heavy for him. He gathered kindling with fingers that were always red and chapped, and he developed a cough. A dry, persistent bark that woke Bryony in the middle of the night and filled her with a terror so primal it bypassed her brain entirely and went straight to the animal center of her being. Her child was getting sick on this empty, exposed piece of ground with no shelter, no medicine, no help. Harlan's words echoed. every night, like a curse. We will find what is left of her in the spring. The despair came in waves. Some days she could hold it at bay, could focus on the work, the rhythm of it. Stone and water and fire and sleep. But other days it crashed over her like black water, and she could not breathe, could not think, could not see any future that did not end exactly the way Harlan had predicted. The cellar room began to glow in her mind, not with the sickly light of servitude anymore, with the warm amber light of safety. Walls, a roof, a stove that drew well, her son's cough getting better instead of worse. The breaking point came on a night in the middle of September. The moon was a thin, cold blade in a sky the color of a bruise. The temperature dropped like a stone thrown into a well, and Rowan, huddled under their only 2 blankets, shivered in his sleep, his small body racked with tremors, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that sounded to Bryony like a clock counting down the minutes until something terrible and permanent happened. She made the decision. In the morning, she would pack the wagon, drive back to Kettle Creek, walk into Harlan Crestwood's trading post, accept the cellar. The word tasted like ashes, like surrender, like the death of everything Callum had been and everything she had promised him she would be. But she would say it, because her son was shivering, and pride was a luxury that mothers could not afford. With the decision made, a terrible calm settled over her. The peace that comes when you stop fighting and let the current take you. She decided to sort through the last of Callum's possessions. A single heavy chest he had insisted on bringing to the site before he died. One last act of tidying before she closed this chapter of her life forever. The chest was mostly tools, heavy mallets, chisels of varying sizes, a plumb bob on a length of string, things that belonged to a stonemason's hands. They felt alien and accusatory in her grip, as though they knew she was not the person they had been made for. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were the notebooks, 3 of them, bound in thick leather, dense with Callum's angular handwriting and precise, intricate drawings. She pulled the lantern closer, its sickly yellow light a small, brave protest against the enormous dark. The first notebook was geology, detailed notes on granite and schist and limestone, maps of the property with deposits marked in red ink. One deposit in particular was circled 3 times and annotated with the word quality in capital letters. Bryony did not know what it meant. She set it aside. The third notebook was mathematics, complex equations, geometric proofs, calculations that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Pages of numbers and angles and ratios that her untrained eye could not begin to decipher. She almost closed it immediately, but something caught her attention. A drawing simpler than the equations surrounding it. A cross-section of what appeared to be a drainage system. Channels cut into the earth around a foundation, leading water away from the base of a wall. She did not understand its significance. Not yet. She almost stopped there, almost set the notebooks back in the chest and closed the lid on Callum's incomprehensible genius forever. The morning was coming. The wagon was waiting. The cellar was waiting. But something made her open the second notebook, and everything changed. This one was different. Less technical. More personal. Callum had written in it the way a man writes in a journal. Ideas. Philosophy. Observations about the land that bordered on poetry. He wrote about the wind as a force to be understood, not an enemy to be endured. He wrote about the sun as an engine, not just a source of light. He wrote about the earth beneath their feet as a reservoir of constant, gentle heat, not dead soil. And then she found the drawings, 2 cabins, 2 small, identical structures set close together. Their long walls parallel, separated by a narrow gap. Between them, Callum had drawn dozens of arrows depicting the flow of air, the radiation of heat, the path of the sun across the sky at different times of day. Beneath the most detailed diagram, in his careful, angular hand, he had written a single sentence. Still air is the warmest coat. Bryony read it 3 times, and something in her chest, that ember, that stubborn, dying ember she had carried out of Harlan's trading post, caught fire. She read on, her heart beginning to pound with a rhythm she had not felt since before Callum's death. He called it the Plenum House. An ancient design adapted from the windswept islands of his Scottish ancestors, where timber was precious, but stone was abundant, and the wind never stopped. The logic was counterintuitive, which was why the world had forgotten it. A single large house fights the cold on 4 fronts. It bleeds heat from every wall, every crack. The larger the structure, the more heat it requires, and the more it loses. But 2 small cabins built close together become allies. They share the burden. And the space between them, the plenum sealed from the wind, becomes a massive, invisible blanket, warmed gently by the sun striking its dark inner walls, warmed from below by the constant, latent heat of the earth. This trapped, motionless air stabilizes, mediates the extremes, creates a buffer zone, a jacket of stillness that insulates the 2 living spaces far more effectively than any single wall of stone or timber ever could. The 2 small cabins do not fight winter's full fury. They face only the gentle, moderated climate of their own creation. Bryony stared at the drawings, at the fierce, confident strokes of Callum's pencil. This was not madness. This was genius. This was why he had chosen this land. Not for what it lacked, but for what it had. The stone to build the walls, the clay for the mortar, and the relentless punishing wind that made his design not just clever, but necessary. She turned the page, and her heart sank. The next several pages were damaged. Water had gotten into the notebook at some point, probably during transport. The ink had bled and smeared into illegibility. She could make out fragments, partial dimensions, the ghost of a diagram showing the roof structure, pieces of instructions for sealing the plenum. But the critical details were gone. She had the concept. She had the principle. She had enough to understand what Callum had been trying to do. She did not have enough to know if she could do it. She closed the notebook, held it against her chest, and for the first time since Callum had died, she cried. Not the numb, hollow weeping of grief, but hot, fierce tears of something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. In the morning, she did not pack the wagon. She stood at the edge of the foundation and looked at it with new eyes. It was not a failed beginning. It was a gift. Callum had laid this foundation for the plenum house. The dimensions were right. The orientation was right, east to west, maximizing the southern sun exposure on the inner walls of the plenum. He had positioned it with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was building, even if no one else did. She had the foundation. She had the principle. She had 2 good hands and a back that had not yet broken. She began. The work was beyond anything she had ever imagined. A war fought 1 stone at a time against the clock and the cold and the limits of her own body. The land, which had seemed so barren, was in fact a quarry. Generations of frost heave had pushed countless stones to the surface. From fist-sized rocks to boulders that seemed rooted in the core of the earth. She started with the smaller ones, using a crude sledge made from a wagon board to haul them to the foundation. Her hands, soft from a life of domesticity, were raw by noon on the first day. By the end of the first week, they were a lattice of blisters and cuts that cracked and bled every morning when she flexed them awake. She found the clay deposit Callum had marked in the first notebook, a shallow pit a 1/4 mile to the east. She dug it out with a spade, her back screaming, and hauled it back bucket by agonizing bucket. She mixed the mortar, following what instructions she could decipher from the damaged pages. Clay, sand, water, ash from their nightly fires. A thick, gritty slurry that smelled of the earth and of smoke. The glue that would hold their world together. Her days fell into a brutal, monotonous rhythm. Haul stone, mix mortar, lift, set. Check the level with the plumb bob Callum had left her. Haul more stone. Her grief, which had been a paralyzing fog, began to change shape. It became fuel. Every stone she lifted was a conversation with her husband. The crack of her hammer on a stubborn edge was her anger at his leaving. The perfect seating of a cornerstone was a shared triumph across the divide between the living and the dead. Rowan became her shadow. He could not lift the heavy stones, but he hauled water. He stirred mortar with a stick nearly as tall as he was. He gathered kindling in bundles that he dragged across the ground because they were too heavy to carry. And slowly, his cough began to fade, as though the purpose they had found, the daily rhythm of work and progress, was medicine of a kind that no doctor's bag could provide. The walls rose, painfully. 2 small, identical structures on the foundation. Their long walls parallel, separated by an 8-foot gap. She built them by feel and instinct, using Callum's concept as her guide, where the damaged pages left her blind. They were simple, brutish. Rectangles of stone with no thought for beauty, only for strength and for the integrity of the seal that would make the plenum work. 3 weeks in, the walls were waist high, and a rider appeared on the eastern horizon. Corwin Thorne was 60 years old, lean as a fence rail, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone Bryony was building with. He lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the settlement's timberline, a woodcutter by trade, a hermit by temperament. He spoke to people when commerce required it, and not one word more. He came with a wagon loaded with heavy beams, the roof timbers Bryony had sent word she needed to buy. She had scraped together her last dollars for them, every cent she had left in the world. He pulled up to the site, climbed down from his wagon, and stood there for a long moment, looking at the 2 half-finished structures, at the gap between them, at the woman covered in dust and dried mortar, with hands that looked like they belonged to a coal miner. He walked to the foundation, knelt, ran his hand along the stone, stood, walked the length of the gap between the 2 structures, stopped, turned. "Where did you learn to lay stone?" It was not a question. "My husband's notebooks." "Callum Ashwell." "Yes." Something changed in Corwin's face, a flicker of recognition. "I knew your husband before, in Vermont. We worked the quarries at Barre together 15 years ago, before either of us came west." Bryony set down the stone she was holding. "He never mentioned you. He would not have. We were not friends. We were colleagues. But I watched him work. I watched him study. He was not like the other men in the quarry. They cut stone. He listened to it." Corwin paused. He spent his evenings reading old books, histories of building, techniques from Scotland, the islands, places where men had been building with stone and wind for 1,000 years. He looked at the gap again. "This is the plenum." He said it the way a man names a river he has heard about but never seen. "You know about it." He talked about it once, at the quarry. The other men laughed at him. I did not laugh, but I did not understand either. A pause. "I think perhaps I am beginning to." He unloaded the beams. He refused payment. Bryony protested. He ignored her protest with the serene indifference of a man who has already made up his mind and considers further discussion a waste of oxygen. But before he left, he turned back, and the look on his face was no longer distant. It was urgent. "Your husband's land, Crestwood knows its value, more than he lets on, more than the $40. "What do you mean?" "The limestone deposit, the one your husband marked on his maps. It is not ordinary limestone. It is high grade, pure enough for construction, pure enough for industry. There is nothing like it for 200 miles. Crestwood has known since before your husband bought the land. He let Callum buy it because Callum was a stonemason, not a businessman. He figured the fool would fail, and the land would come back to him for the price of the debt." Bryony felt something cold settle in her stomach. The $40. The $40. The debt. The contract. It was never charity, Mistress Ashwell. It was a trap, set before your husband was even in the ground. And then he was gone, his wagon creaking down the track toward the timberline. leaving Bryony standing in the wind with a new understanding of the world she was living in. An understanding that was colder and sharper than any prairie winter. Harlan Crestwood did not want to save her. He wanted to bury her. Because her land, her worthless, barren, impossible land, was worth a fortune. She worked harder after that, faster, with a fury that bordered on recklessness. The walls grew, waist high, chest high, head high. She left openings for doors and small windows, framing them with salvaged timber from a collapsed outbuilding at the far edge of the property. Her hands thickened into leather. The muscles in her arms and back defined themselves like ropes beneath her sun-darkened skin. She barely recognized herself when she caught her reflection in the water bucket. Good. She did not want to be the woman she had been. That woman had stood in Harlan Crestwood's trading post and almost said yes. And then one morning, she woke to find the western wall. The wall she had spent 3 days building, the wall that had been head high and solid and perfectly plumbed when she had gone to sleep, reduced to rubble. Someone had pushed it over in the night. The stones were scattered in a pattern that spoke of deliberate force applied from the outside. And in the soft earth at the base of the wall, hoof prints, deep and fresh. 2 horses, the tracks leading away to the south, toward Kettle Creek. Bryony stood in the wreckage, her fists clenched, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts that were not sobs and not screams, but something in between that had no name. Rowan came out of the wagon, saw the wall, saw his mother. He did not speak. He walked to the mortar pit, picked up his stick, and began to stir. She looked at her son, at his small set jaw, at his dark hair blowing in the wind, at his hands already calloused at 7 years old. Something in her solidified, turned from iron to steel. They wanted her gone. They wanted her broken. They wanted her in that cellar on her knees, washing their sheets, while they stole her husband's land and his legacy and every dream he had ever committed to paper. 58 days left on the original debt, winter closing in, an enemy in the settlement who would stop at nothing, and a set of water-damaged notebooks that held the answers she needed in a language she could only partially read. She picked up a stone, tested its weight, found its flat face, set it in a fresh bed of mortar, and began again. She rebuilt the western wall in 2 days, because fury is a better mason than patience, because every stone she lifted now had a name. She used the largest stones she could manage for the base course, stones that would take 2 men and a crowbar to move. And she did not just stack them. She locked them, interlocking the irregular faces the way Callum's drawings had shown her, each stone cradling the one beside it, each joint staggered, each course bound to the one below, with a thick, aggressive layer of clay mortar that she packed into every gap with her fingers until her hands bled. Let them come again. She started sleeping in the half-finished eastern cabin instead of the wagon. Colder, more exposed, but she could see the western wall from where she lay, and anyone approaching the western wall could see her. Rowan's cough continued to improve. The daily work, the fresh air, the food she had learned to cook over a fire she could now build in under 3 minutes. These things were slowly pulling him back from whatever edge the first terrible weeks had pushed him toward. 12 days after the wall was rebuilt, she saw 2 riders approaching from the south. The smaller one on a roan mare she did not recognize. The larger one on a black gelding she did. Harlan Crestwood. And beside him, a man she had seen only twice before at town meetings, where he sat at the front and spoke with the quiet, unassailable authority of a man who held the law in his pocket like a watch. Magistrate Edmund Price. Price was a thin man, precise, with a narrow face and pale eyes that cataloged everything they landed on and assigned it a value. He wore a dark coat too fine for the frontier, a silk cravat spotted with trail dust, and he carried a leather satchel that Bryony recognized instinctively for what it was. Arsenal. They dismounted. Harlan with the heavy, deliberate grace of a man descending from a throne. Price with the quick, efficient movements of a man who does not like spending time outdoors and intends to conclude his business as rapidly as possible. Bryony was mortaring a stone into the eastern wall. She did not stop working, did not turn around. She heard their boots on the rocky ground. Heard Harlan clear his throat, heard the scratch of Price's pen as he began writing in a small bound notebook before he had even opened his mouth. "Mistress Ashwell," Price said. His voice was dry, papery, the voice of documents and proceedings. "I am here in an official capacity." "I can see that." "There has been a development regarding your late husband's debt to Mr. Crestwood." Now she turned. Price produced a single sheet of paper from his satchel and held it out with the careful formality of a man serving a warrant, which she realized with a cold dropping sensation in her stomach was essentially what he was doing. "A supplementary clause to the original contract, signed by your husband, dated 3 weeks before his passing. It amends the repayment period from 90 days to 60. Bryony took the paper. Her hands were shaking from the effort of keeping her voice level. She read it. The language was dense, legal, but the numbers were clear. 60 days from date of default, and the date of default was the date of Callum's death. The original deadline had just been pulled forward by a full month. She had been counting on 58 remaining days. Now she had 28 days to pay $40. When she had $11.30, she looked at the signature at the bottom. Callum's name, in what appeared to be Callum's hand. But something about it was wrong. The letters were too careful, too even. Callum wrote the way he worked with confidence and speed. His signature had always been a quick, aggressive slash across the page. This one looked like someone had traced it. Slowly, deliberately. She opened her mouth to say so, and then she saw Rowan. Her son was standing by the mortar pit, stirring the slurry with his stick, and he was coughing. A short, dry bark that doubled him over for just a moment before he straightened up and went back to stirring. It was nothing. A remnant. The ghost of the cough that was already fading. But Price's head swiveled toward the sound like a weather vane catching a shift in the wind. and his pen moved across his notebook. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 3 quick, precise strokes. And Bryony understood. This was not about the debt. The debt was the hook, the lever. But the real play, the endgame, was standing by the mortar pit, stirring clay with a stick. They were going to take her son. Price was building a case, documenting conditions. A child living in the open on a barren prairie. No proper shelter. No school. A cough. A mother either too proud or too deranged to accept the reasonable alternative offered to her. A case for the territorial court. A petition for transfer of guardianship. She looked at Harlan, standing back, arms crossed, face arranged in that familiar mask of benevolent concern. But his eyes were calculating, measuring, watching her the way a man watches a snare he has set. He did not just want the land. He wanted leverage. The child was the lever. Take the boy and the mother will do anything. Sign anything. Surrender anything. Something inside Bryony shifted. Something deeper than anger, deeper than fear. The way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake. Silent, invisible, world-changing. She handed the paper back to Price. Her hands were no longer shaking. I acknowledge the document. I dispute the signature, and I will repay the debt within the amended period. Price blinked. Harlan's arms uncrossed slightly. With what means? Price asked. With the means that this land provides. She turned her back on them, picked up a stone, set it in the mortar. The dismissal was absolute. Price stood there a moment, his pen hovering. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. Harlan followed. Neither spoke, but Harlan looked back once, and the look on his face was not anger or pity. It was patience. The patient confidence of a man who knows the outcome is inevitable, who knows winter is coming, and who is willing to wait. Bryony went to the first notebook, Callum's geology notebook. The one with the maps and the mineral deposits and the word quality circled 3 times in red ink. The limestone. She found the deposit the next morning, a 1/4 mile northwest of the foundation, exactly where Callum had marked it. A shallow outcropping of pale gray stone that broke clean and true when she struck it with a chisel. Even she could see the difference between this and the rough field boulders she had been building with. Fine-grained, dense, uniform in color, stone that had value beyond its weight. She cut a dozen blocks, small ones, loaded them onto the sledge and dragged them to the track. Then she walked 3 miles to Corwin Thorne's cabin. He listened, did not interrupt. When she finished explaining what she needed, a buyer who would pay fair price and not report the transaction to Crestwood, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the fire in his small iron stove. I know a man in Bridger, a contractor, building a bank. He needs dressed limestone for the facade. He has been hauling it 60 miles from the south at considerable expense. How much would he pay? $3 a cartload, maybe 4 if the quality is what you say. Bryony did the math. $40 minus 11, $29 needed, at $3 a load. 10 cartloads in 28 days, while simultaneously building a house. Impossible. except that impossible had become a word that no longer applied to her life. Her life had left impossible behind somewhere around the second day of hauling stones with bleeding hands. She cut limestone. She hauled it. Corwin transported it to his contact in Bridger and took nothing for the service. She protested. He gave her the same serene, indifferent look he had given her when she tried to pay for the roof timbers. The money came in. Slowly. $3. 3 more. 4 for a particularly fine batch. She kept the coins in a tin under her bedroll and counted them every night by candlelight, building a wall against something far more dangerous than winter. And she kept building. Both cabins reached full height, rough rectangles of mortared stone with openings for doors and windows. The gap between them, the 8-foot corridor that would become the plenum, was clearly visible now. A strange, deliberate emptiness that made no sense to anyone who did not know its purpose. And then the rain came. A brutal 3-day deluge that turned the prairie into a shallow lake and the ground around the foundation into a swamp. Water pooled at the base of the western wall, seeped into the earth, saturated the soil that supported the lowest course of stones. Bryony heard it before she saw it, a sound deep and grinding. She was inside the eastern cabin checking the mortar on a window frame. The sound made her freeze, made her grab Rowan by the arm and pull him toward the door. They got out just in time. The western wall sagged. The bottom course shifted tilted, and then gravity took over. 3 weeks of labor slid sideways into a heap of rubble and mud. Not sabotage this time, her own failure. She had not dug the foundation deep enough on the western side, had not accounted for the water table, had not understood that the saturated soil would lose its ability to bear the load. Callum would have known. Callum would have planned for it. Callum was dead. Bryony stood in the rain, in mud up to her ankles, and she stared at the collapsed wall. And something in her that had been rigid and unyielding for weeks cracked. She sank to her knees in the muck, and she wept. Not quietly or decorously. She wept the way a person weeps when the last thread of hope has been cut. The sound swallowed by the rain and the wind and the vast, indifferent prairie. Rowan found her there. He did not speak. He stood in the rain beside his mother, his hair plastered to his skull, his small body shivering. And he held out a book, the 3rd notebook, the mathematics, the one she had set aside as useless. He had it open to a page near the middle, the drawing of the drainage system, channels cut into the earth around a foundation, angled, precise, leading water away from the base of the walls. And here in the mathematics notebook were the calculations behind it. The angles, the depths, the specific relationship between soil type and drainage capacity that determined exactly how deep the channels needed to be and at what grade they needed to slope. Callum had anticipated this exact problem. The drainage system was not a backup plan. It was step 1. Before the walls, before the mortar, before anything else, you controlled the water. The mathematics notebook was not separate from the building plans. It was the engineering manual. The book that translated the concept in Notebook 2 into the specific practical instructions needed to actually build the thing. 3 notebooks, 3 layers of knowledge. The geology of the land, the vision of the design, and the engineering to make it real. Callum had not left her one book of answers. He had left her a curriculum. And she was learning it one disaster at a time. Bryony wiped her face, took the notebook from her son's hands, kissed the top of his wet head, and started digging drainage trenches. It took 4 days of digging channels in waterlogged ground, hauling mud and clay, shaping the angles with a level made from a plank and a cup of water. 4 days that felt like regression because she was not building walls, she was digging ditches, and every day she dug was a day the walls did not rise and the deadline drew closer. But when the trenches were done and the water began to flow away from the foundation instead of pooling against it, she rebuilt the western wall a 3rd time. And this time it held. Corwin Thorne appeared the next morning as though he had timed his visit to the moment she needed help most. He brought lumber, additional beams, shorter pieces for window frames and door frames, and the critical connection points where the roof would tie the 2 cabins into a single structure. He also brought his hands. He did not ask or offer. He picked up a stone, checked its face, set it in the mortar bed, and began working alongside her. They worked in silence for an hour before Corwin spoke. Without looking up from the stone he was fitting, "I owe your husband a debt." Bryony waited. "At the quarry in Vermont, I had an accident. A block shifted, pinned my leg. The other men had gone for the day. It was winter, dark by 4. If I had spent the night under that block, I would have lost the leg. Maybe more." He set the stone, reached for another. Callum came back, said he had forgotten a tool. I think he came back because he was the kind of man who checked, who could not leave a place without making sure everything was in order. He found me. He used a lever and 2 pieces of scrap timber, and he lifted a block that weighed 800 pounds off my leg. Alone, in the dark. He paused. He never mentioned it again. Not to me, not to anyone. He looked at Bryony directly for the first time. "I do not help you because I am kind, Mistress Ashwell. I help you because I am in debt, and I pay my debts." They worked together. The walls rose faster. Corwin was 60, and his hands were stiff in the cold. But faster. Enough to feel the difference. The money from the limestone continued trickling in. Bryony cut stone in the early mornings before the building day began. Her body had become a machine now, a thing of sinew and callus and mechanical repetition that she operated with the detached efficiency of a woman who had stopped thinking about comfort. $22 saved, 18 to go, 14 days remaining. And then Harlan came back. Alone this time. No price, no documents, just a man on a horse riding up in the late afternoon light, dismounting, standing, looking at what she had built. The 2 cabins were nearly complete, head-high walls of fitted stone. The 8-foot gap between them clearly defined, clearly intentional, clearly bizarre by any standard of conventional frontier construction. Harlan walked the length of the site slowly, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. the posture of a man inspecting property he already considers his own. He stopped in front of the plenum space. "2 sheds," he said. "You built 2 sheds." Bryony was on the roof of the eastern cabin laying the last course of capstones. She did not look down. "They are not sheds. They are not a house either. A house has 1 roof, 1 hearth. This is 2 separate structures, separated by an empty corridor that will fill with snow the moment the first storm hits. You will need twice the firewood. You will freeze twice as fast." "We will see." The performative concern dropped from his voice. What was left was the raw material beneath. Cold, hard, certain. "I have been patient, Mistress Ashwell. More than patient. I have extended every courtesy. And you have used that time to build a monument to your husband's madness on land you cannot afford to keep." Bryony climbed down from the wall, stood facing him across the gap, the plenum between them like a line drawn in the dirt. "My husband was not mad. Your husband was a dreamer. And dreamers die cold and broke on this prairie. That is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. My husband was not a sensible man, Mr. Crestwood. He was a clever one. And there is a difference you will come to understand." Something flickered across Harlan's face. Irritation. The irritation of a man who has explained a simple concept 3 times and cannot understand why it will not take. "I will have the land," he said quietly, "before the first snow falls, and the boy. Price has seen enough. The territorial court will act in the child's best interest, which is not here." Bryony did not flinch, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing the terror his words sent through her. "My son and I will be warmer in our folly than we ever would have been in your cellar, Mr. Crestwood. We will remain." He stared at her, then turned, mounted his horse, rode away without a backward glance, the set of his shoulders radiating the grim satisfaction of a man whose prophecy is about to be fulfilled. His visit intended to break her did the opposite. 3 nights later, Nessa Hargrove appeared. She came after dark, on foot, shawl pulled over her head, moving through the tall grass with the quick, nervous energy of a woman doing something she believes is right but knows is dangerous. Nessa was 32, wife of Aldous Hargrove, a carpenter in Kettle Creek, a small, careful woman with sharp eyes and a mouth she had learned to keep closed in public. She brought bread, dried apples, a small pouch of medicinal tea for Rowan's cough. She also brought information. They sat inside the eastern cabin by candlelight, speaking in low voices while Rowan slept. "Crestwood is not waiting for winter," Nessa said. "He has already filed a petition with Price, a hearing, after the first snow, for guardianship of your boy." Bryony said nothing. She had expected this, but hearing it spoken in another woman's voice made it real in a way her own fears had not. "He has told the town you are keeping the child in dangerous conditions, that you are unfit, that you are suffering from grief madness. And the town believes him. The town does not know what to believe. They see a woman alone on the prairie building something no one understands. Some pity you. Some admire you. Most think you will be dead before Christmas. But they do not question Crestwood. He owns the store. He holds the credit. He decides who eats in winter and who does not. You do not cross Harlan Crestwood in Kettle Creek." Bryony looked at her. And yet, here you are. Nessa's mouth twitched, almost a smile. My husband is a good man, a quiet man. He does not make trouble, but he is not blind. She reached into the folds of her shawl and produced a piece of paper. Folded, creased. A rough map drawn in a carpenter's careful hand. Property lines. The position of the limestone deposit. The limestone on your land. It is the only high-grade deposit within 200 miles. A man came to the trading post from outside the territory. Represents a company. They are building rail stations, post offices, government buildings. They need limestone, a great deal of it, and they are willing to pay. How much? Aldous heard numbers, hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands, over years. Bryony stared at the map, at the neat circle around the deposit. The word quality. Callum had known. He had bought this land because he could read stone the way other men read newspapers. And he had seen a future in this barren ground that no one else could see. Nessa spoke again, quieter now. There is one more thing. The paper price showed you. The one that shortened the debt to 60 days. My husband saw the original contract in Crestwood's office months ago. He repaired the desk where Crestwood keeps his documents. Bryony waited. The signature on the supplement. Aldous says it does not match. The letters are too careful, too slow. He believes it is a forgery. The word hung in the air, a word that could destroy Harlan Crestwood if it could be proven. Can Aldous testify to this? Nessa's face tightened. He is afraid. We all are. Crestwood controls everything. If Aldous speaks against him, we lose the store credit. We cannot buy seed in spring. Bryony nodded. She understood. Fear was not cowardice on the frontier, where survival depended on the goodwill of the man who held the keys to the storeroom. Thank you, she said, for coming, for telling me. Nessa stood, pulled the shawl over her head, looked at Bryony with an expression that was equal parts admiration and terror. Build your strange house, Mistress Ashwell. Build it fast, because if you survive the winter, if that house works the way your husband believed it would, you will not need Aldous to testify. The house itself will be the proof. And then she was gone, a shadow moving through the tall grass back toward the settlement. The final push was a controlled and deliberate madness. 16 hours a day, sometimes 18. Bryony laid the heavy beams Corwin had brought across the tops of the 2 cabins spanning the 8-foot gap, creating the skeleton of a single unified roof that would cover both living spaces and the plenum between them. The beams were brutally heavy. She had no crane, no block and tackle. She had a system of levers and fulcrums improvised from stones and salvaged timber. She had Corwin, who came when he could, and she had her own body, which she drove beyond every limit she had previously believed existed. She hoisted them one at a time, levered them into position, secured them with wooden pegs. Each beam a small miracle of physics and stubbornness. The roof planks went on next, rough sawn boards laid across the beams, covering everything. Both cabins, the plenum, one continuous surface. She left a single opening, a small stone-lined hole over the living cabin for the stovepipe, and then the ceiling. The step that would determine whether the plenum was a feat of thermal engineering or just an empty corridor full of freezing air. Every gap, every seam, every crack where the wind might find purchase. Sealed. She mixed the final batches of plaster, clay, and dried grass, applied it with her bare hands, working it into every crevice, every joint between stones, every space where plank met beam, or beam met wall. Inside, then outside, then inside again. Her hands and face smeared with the dark, earthy mixture until she looked like something that had crawled up out of the ground. She painted the inner walls of the plenum with a slurry of soot and clay. Dark, almost black. These walls would face each other across the 8-foot gap, and when the sun entered through the small ventilation gaps she had left at the roofline, the dark surfaces would absorb the heat, hold it, radiate it slowly into the trapped air. Still air is the warmest coat. She could hear Callum's voice in the sentence, could feel his pencil pressing into the page. On the 26th day since Price's visit, she placed the last coins in Corwin's hand. $40, the full amount. He would deliver it to Crestwood with witnesses and a receipt. The debt was paid. She stood at the door of the completed plenum house. Both cabins finished, roof intact, seals checked and rechecked. Heavy plank doors at both ends of the plenum hung and barred. One cabin for living, the other for storage. Firewood stacked along the inner wall. The small iron stove connected to its chimney drawing well. Everything in order, and the sky turned the color of hammered lead. It happened the way weather happens on the high prairie. 1 hour the sun was shining, the next it was swallowed by a wall of clouds so dense it looked like the sky was being erased. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 30 minutes, 20 in an hour. The wind died completely, fell away to nothing. Animals vanished. The prairie dogs disappeared underground. A hawk broke off its circling and flew south with the urgent, desperate wing beats of a creature that knows what is coming. Bryony looked at the sickly, jaundiced light staining the western horizon. She had never seen weather like this, but she knew what it meant because Callum had written about it. When the wind stops, when the animals hide, when the western sky turns the color of an old bruise. Get inside. Bar the doors. Because what is coming will test everything you have built and everything you are. She moved their belongings into the living cabin. Bedrolls, blankets, food, water, the notebooks. She checked the stove, loaded it with dry wood, lit it. The chimney drew perfectly. She checked the storage cabin. Firewood, food stores, water barrels, everything where it should be. She stepped into the plenum, the central corridor. Dark, 8 feet wide, 16 long. Its floor, hard-packed earth. Its walls, the dark, plastered inner faces of the 2 cabins. The air inside was cool, but already calmer than anything outside. She secured the heavy plank doors at both ends, barred them with oak beams and iron brackets Corwin had forged. Then she went into the living cabin, closed the inner door, sat on her cot beside Rowan, and waited. The storm came as a concussion, a physical blow that made the stone walls shudder. A low moan that escalated in seconds to a full-throated shriek. The world outside the small window vanished into a solid churning wall of white horizontal, moving so fast it looked less like snow and more like a river of ice. The sound was extraordinary. A probing, malevolent force testing every stone, every seam, seeking a single crack through which it could pour its killing cold. A sound designed to break the will. Inside the cabin, the roar was muted, distant. Something huge and furious locked outside. The air was cool, but still. Bryony lit the stove. The fire crackled. The iron sides radiated warmth. They ate salted pork and dried beans, drank hot water with a pinch of sugar, wrapped themselves in blankets out of habit more than need. After they ate, Bryony took a candle from the shelf, lit it. "Come with me," she said. She unbarred the inner door to the plenum and stepped through. The corridor was dark, cooler than the living space, but the quality of the air was astonishing, utterly still. No movement, no draft, no whisper of the apocalypse raging on the other side of the outer walls. She walked to the center, knelt, placed the candle on the hard-packed earth. Its flame rose into a perfect golden teardrop. It did not dance, did not flicker, did not tremble. It stood as straight and still as if it were painted on the air. She pressed her palm against the dark wall of the living cabin. Warmth bled through the stone, gentle and pervasive. Their small stove was not fighting the storm alone. Its heat was seeping into the plenum, charging the still air, turning the entire corridor into a massive, invisible buffer that held warmth the way a lake holds water. The opposite wall, the storage cabin side, was cool to the touch, but not cold, absorbing the ambient warmth, holding it, an equilibrium so delicate it seemed less engineered than organic. Rowan stared at the candle, at its impossible stillness. "Papa was right," he whispered. "Yes," Bryony said. "Papa was right." She put her arm around her son, and for a long moment they knelt together in the stillness, while the storm spent its fury on the outer walls and could not touch them. Then came a sound that was not the storm. Something closer. A sharp crack from above, like a rifle shot, followed by a groan. Long, deep, wood under tremendous stress. Bryony looked up. The center roof beam, the longest one spanning the full 8-foot width of the plenum, was bowing. She could see it in the candlelight. A curve that had not been there before, the weight of the snow pressing down. Wood fibers at the center beginning to separate. Tiny white fractures opening along the grain. If it broke, the roof would collapse. The seal would fail. The wind would pour into the plenum, and everything, the warmth, the stillness, the proof, would die. She grabbed Rowan by the shoulders. The grip of a mother who has 3 seconds to communicate something that cannot be misunderstood. "Stay in the cabin. Bar the door. Do not come out." His eyes were wide. She did not wait for him to argue. She pushed him gently through the inner door, heard the scrape of the bar on the other side. She turned back to the plenum, held the candle up. The beam was still groaning, the curve deepening. She could see the wood fibers separating. She had minutes. The firewood in the storage cabin. There were logs thick enough to serve as a temporary column if she could get one into position. She unbarred the storage door, found a piece of spruce near the back, 8 feet long, thick as her forearm, straight. It was supposed to keep them warm for a week. Now it was going to keep them alive for a night. She dragged it out, wrestled it upright, directly beneath the bowing beam. The math was simple. Wedge the log vertically between the floor and the beam. Let it take the load. She tilted it, maneuvered the top toward the sagging center, pushed. The log slid sideways, fell, hit the earth floor with a dull thud. She tried again, got it to catch. The beam stopped groaning. For 1 second, the system was in equilibrium. Log against beam, beam against roof, roof against the weight of the storm. Then the base shifted. The packed earth was not perfectly flat. A slight depression no deeper than an inch. The base slipped. The top kicked sideways. The log came down again. The beam groaned louder. The fractures widened. Small, sharp pops like knuckles cracking. Wood surrendering to forces it was never designed to bear alone. She was on her knees in the dark. Her candle had gone out. The only light was a faint gray glow seeping through the gaps around the plenum doors. And she could not get the column to hold because the floor was not flat, because she had not thought to level it, because Callum would have thought of it, and she was not Callum, and everything she had built was about to come apart because of 1 inch of uneven dirt. The bar scraped, the inner door opened, a small figure stepped into the plenum.
"Rowan, I told you to stay."
"I know." He knelt beside her in the darkness, put something in her hand. Small, wooden, triangular, a wedge, cut from a scrap of firewood with the small knife she had given him for whittling. The knife he had been using for weeks to carve wooden birds and horses that he lined up on the windowsill. He had carved a shim. While she was struggling, he had heard the scrape of the base on the uneven floor, the slip, the fall. And he had solved it the way his father would have solved it, with a small piece of wood cut to the right angle. He was 7 years old. Bryony positioned the log again, tilted it, pushed the top against the beam. And this time, while she held it steady, Rowan crept to the base and jammed the wedge into the gap between log and earth. The base held. The log took the weight. The beam stopped groaning, stopped bowing. The fractures closed. Bryony knelt in the darkness with her hands on the log, feeling it vibrate with the transferred load of the roof and the snow and the storm. Feeling it hold. She pulled Rowan against her chest. 2 hearts in the dark, in the stillness, while the world outside tried to destroy everything they had built. "You were supposed to stay in the cabin," she whispered. I know, he said. She relit the candle, set it on the floor. The flame rose straight. The seal was unbroken. The air was still. The beam held. The storm raged for 4 days. 4 days and 4 nights of unbroken fury. Snow fell not in flakes, but in sheets, in solid curtains that buried the world. Inside the plenum house, time lost its meaning. There was no sunrise or sunset, only the clock of the stove. Load wood. Wait. Load more. Eat. Sleep. Wake. Check the candle. The candle was their compass. As long as it burned straight, they were safe. Bryony read to Rowan from a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, a story about a man stranded on an island building shelter, surviving through ingenuity. The irony was not lost on her. Except she was not on an island. She was on a sea of grass and snow, and she was not alone. On the second day, she checked the storage cabin. The water barrels had a thin crust of ice on top, but the water beneath was liquid. 33 or 34 degrees in the plenum. Miserable in open air. But in the stillness, with no wind to strip the heat from the body, it felt merely brisk. The living cabin stayed warm. A moderate burn was enough. The heat seeped gently into the plenum where the still air held. It reflected it back. The 2 cabins were cooperating, sharing warmth through the medium of motionless air. On the morning of the 5th day, silence. The wind simply ceased. The silence that followed was so absolute that Bryony's ears rang with it. She unbarred the front plenum door and pushed. It would not budge. She pushed harder, scraped it open a foot. Behind it, a solid wall of snow higher than the door. But above the snow sky, a washed-out blue, and silence deeper than she had ever known. She dug out with a cookpot as a shovel. Took an hour to clear a passage. She emerged into a world she did not recognize. The prairie was gone, replaced by a white landscape rolling to the horizon in every direction. Smooth, featureless. The sun was low and pale. The air so cold it burned her lungs, but it was still. And the thin gray plume from her chimney rose perfectly vertical into the sky. A signal that someone was alive in this buried world. In Kettle Creek, the storm had been a catastrophe. The gale force winds had found every weakness in every structure, every gap in chinking, every loose shingle, every poorly fitted window. The wind drove fine dry snow into attics and through floorboards, creating a damp cold that no fire could defeat. And the firewood was nearly gone. 4 days of burning at maximum capacity. Stoking fires to roaring infernos that devoured logs at 3 times the normal rate, just to keep temperatures above freezing. And still the cold came in. Harlan Crestwood's home, the largest and best built in the settlement, had fared better than most. But a persistent draft had established itself in his main room. His storeroom was perilously close to freezing. 3 families had been forced from their homes entirely and were huddled in the church. The town was cold, afraid, and running out of options. Harlan stood on his porch on the second day after the storm, looking at the damaged roofs, the buried buildings, the desperate smoke columns from chimneys burning the last of the firewood. And he thought about the widow. She was dead. Of course she was dead. Out there with her 2 stone sheds and her gap and her dead husband's nonsense notebooks. The storm would have torn those structures apart. He had predicted it. We will find what is left of her in the spring. The words tasted different now. In September, surrounded by skeptical men, they had tasted like certainty, like a statement of physics as reliable as gravity. Now, standing on his frozen porch, with his own house damaged and 3 families homeless, they tasted like a sentence he had passed on a woman and a child. A grim sense of duty. That is what he told himself. Duty mingled with the practical need to confirm what he already knew. He fashioned crude snowshoes from barrel staves, wrapped his face in wool, and set out. The journey nearly killed him. 3 hours through waist-deep snow crusted with ice that broke under his weight and trapped his legs. The cold stripped away heat and will in equal measure. He stopped twice, considered turning back, did not, because the thought of the widow had lodged in his mind and would not be dislodged. He crested the final rise and stopped. The house stood squat and defiant, half buried in drift snow but not collapsed, and from the stone chimney, a plume of smoke, thin, gray, rising straight up with the precision of a drawn line. He stared at that smoke, at that impossible vertical thread against the pale blue sky. She was alive. He floundered through the last 50 yards, reached the plenum door, hammered on it with his fist. The sound of a bar lifting. The door scraped open. Bryony stood there wearing a simple woolen dress, her face calm, eyes clear. She held no surprise. She had known someone would come. She just had not known it would be him. He stepped into the plenum, and he felt it immediately. The air was cool, but perfectly still. So absolutely motionless, it felt like stepping into a different world. He saw the candle on a small crate in the center of the corridor, its flame standing straight without the slightest tremor. Bryony opened the inner door, and warmth hit him, gentle, pervasive. It carried the scent of wood smoke and baked bread and something he had no word for. He saw Rowan sitting at a small table carving a piece of wood with a small knife, wearing a shirt, a single shirt, cheeks flushed with warmth, breathing easy, cough gone. Harlan Crestwood stood in the doorway, the most certain man in Kettle Creek, and felt the bedrock of 55 years crack beneath him. He could not speak. His throat was closed with something he did not recognize because he had not felt it in decades. The raw, disorienting experience of being completely wrong about something he had been completely certain about. Bryony looked at the man who had tried to take her land with a fraudulent contract, who had sent riders to destroy her walls, who had enlisted a magistrate to take her child. She saw him standing there, half frozen, his certainty shattered. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt grace. "Come in, Mr. Crestwood," she said. "You look cold." He stumbled inside. She guided him to a stool by the stove, put a mug of hot broth in his trembling hands. He drank. The warmth spread through his chest, his arms, his frozen legs, through the cold, empty place where his certainty had been. He looked at the smooth stone walls, the heavy roof beams, one supported by a makeshift column, the child carving quietly. His gaze kept returning to the candle in the plenum. "The air," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "In the space between, it does not move."
"No," Bryony said. "It does not."
He shook his head slowly, not the old gesture of condescension, a different shake entirely, the shake of a man watching the walls of his understanding come down stone by stone. "How?" Bryony went to the shelf, took down Callum's second notebook, brought it to him, opened it. She did not recite the physics or explain the theory. She showed him the drawings. She let Callum's pencil do the talking. The two cabins, the arrows, the gap, the sentence at the bottom of the page. She pointed to the damaged sections, the places where the water had smeared the ink. She showed him where she had guessed, and where she had improvised, and where her son had saved the western wall, with a page from the third notebook. Harlan listened in silence, his hands around the mug, his eyes on the drawings. When she finished, he sat for a long time. "I was wrong," he said. 3 words that cost him everything he had spent 55 years building: his reputation, his authority, his identity as the man who knew best. "We were all wrong." He left that afternoon. The journey back was harder than the journey out, but he made it. And when he walked into the trading post, into the circle of anxious faces that had gathered to hear what he had found, he told them. He described the warmth, the stillness, the candle flame, the boy in his single shirt, the woman who had built a house that the worst storm in a decade could not break. They did not believe him. The postmaster laughed. The farrier suggested he had been drinking. One of the cattlemen made a joke about snow blindness. Harlan did not argue. He had spent 55 years arguing, convincing, using the weight of his position to bend others to his view. He did not do that now. He simply said it again, quietly. "She is warm. She is safe. The boy is healthy. And the house she built is better than anything in this settlement." A week later, a delegation of 5 men made the journey. The postmaster, the farrier, Aldous Hargrove, the carpenter, and 2 others. They went with supplies and with skepticism etched into every line of their wind-chapped faces. Bryony welcomed them as she had welcomed Harlan. She showed them the plenum. Let them stand in the corridor, feel the stillness, place their hands on the warm inner wall. She brought out the notebooks, all 3, and by candlelight she explained the design, not as a victor, but as a teacher, sharing knowledge that had been entrusted to her, knowledge that could save their lives. They listened. The skepticism dissolved, not because of her words, but because of the wall beneath their palms. Because of the candle they could see with their own eyes, burning straight and still in the corridor. while the winter pressed against the outer walls and could not get in. They went home changed, but the story was not over. Because Edmund Price had not made the journey, had not seen the plenum, had not felt the still air. And Price was not a man who changed his mind based on the testimony of others. Price was a man of documents, procedures, the written word of the law. And the hearing was still scheduled. It took place in the church. 3 weeks after the storm, the town had dug itself out. Repairs were underway. The crisis was receding, but the memory of it was fresh. The cold, the fear, the sound of the wind pouring through every crack in every cabin. Price sat at a table at the front, a stack of papers before him, his pale eyes scanning the room. Harlan sat in the front row, his face unreadable. Bryony stood alone, no counsel, no advocate. A woman in a plain wool dress with calloused hands and the posture of someone who has spent 3 months carrying stones. Price read the petition in his dry, papery voice. The child, Rowan Ashwell, currently residing on a remote property under the sole care of his mother, Bryony Ashwell, widow, who had refused reasonable alternatives, who had subjected the child to conditions described as dangerous, unsuitable, potentially life-threatening. He produced documents, the original debt contract, the supplementary clause, records of his visit, his notes on the child's cough. He turned to Bryony. Mistress Ashwell, you may speak. She did not raise her voice, did not plead, did not cry. She stood before every person in Kettle Creek and spoke the way she had learned to lay stone. With precision, with patience. My son has not been cold since the house was finished. He has not coughed in 6 weeks. He eats warm food every day. He sleeps under a roof that did not leak or buckle in the worst storm this territory has seen in 10 years. She paused, looked at the faces of men whose roofs had leaked, whose walls had failed, whose families had huddled in this very building for warmth. Every family in this room burned through most of their winter firewood in 4 days. 3 families lost their homes entirely. Mr. Crestwood's own storeroom nearly froze solid, and my son in my house on the high prairie sat in his shirt and carved a wooden bird. She laid the notebooks on the table, opened them to the drawings. My husband designed this house. He was not mad. He was a stonemason who understood things about stone and wind and heat that no one in this room had the humility to consider. And I built it with my hands from the stones on our land. She looked at Price. You are asking whether my son is safe in my care. I invite you to visit the house and answer that question yourself. But I will tell you this. Every child in Kettle Creek spent the blizzard huddled in the cold. Mine did not. Silence. The room held its breath. Price shuffled his papers. His pale eyes moved from Bryony to the notebooks to the faces in the church. He was about to speak when Harlan stood up. It was slow, effortful. A man fighting against every instinct and every habit and every fiber of his identity. The room turned. Harlan Crestwood, the man who had filed the petition, standing with the expression of someone about to step off a cliff. He was silent a long time. long enough for people to shift in their seats and exchange glances. Long enough for Bryony to wonder if the old Harlan, the certain Harlan, had reasserted himself. Then he spoke. "I withdraw the petition." Price looked at him, one eyebrow raised.
On what grounds?
"On the grounds that it was filed in bad faith." A murmur passed through the room. "I have been to the Ashwell property," Harlan said. His voice was steady now, the voice of a man who had passed through the worst of it and come out the other side. "I have seen the house. I have stood in the space between the walls. I have felt the warmth. The boy is healthy, warm, safe, in conditions superior to anything in the settlement, including my own home." He drew a breath. The supplementary clause, the document that shortened the repayment period from 90 days to 60, the signature on that document is not Callum Ashwell's. Dead silence. "I know this because I forged it." The murmur became a roar. Shock, outrage, disbelief. Price's pen stopped moving, his pale eyes fixed on Harlan with a cold intensity. Harlan let the noise wash over him. "I wanted the land, the limestone deposit. I knew its value before Callum Ashwell ever set foot on that property. I let him buy it because I believed he would fail. When he died, I saw an opportunity to take it for the price of a $40 debt. I manipulated the terms. I filed a false document, and I used this court and this petition as instruments of my own greed." He turned to Bryony. "I am sorry, Mistress Ashwell, for the debt, for the deception, for all of it." He reached into his coat, produced the original contract and the forged supplement, held them up, then tore them slowly into pieces that drifted to the floor of the church. Price sat for a long moment, looking at the torn paper, at Harlan, at Bryony. "The petition is withdrawn," he said, his voice as dry and even as ever. "The matter is closed." He gathered his papers, stood, left the church. Bryony stood in the silence that followed. She felt the weight of 3 months lift from her shoulders, not in a rush, but slowly, stone by stone, the way it had been placed there. She looked at Rowan in the back row, his small face serious, dark hair falling across his forehead, hands folded in his lap. He smiled at her, small, quiet. The first real smile since his father died. Spring came to the high prairie all at once. The snow retreated. The grass emerged green and violent and impossibly alive. The wind returned warm and soft, carrying the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. Bryony sat at the table in the living cabin, the third notebook open before her, the mathematics. She had been studying it for weeks, teaching herself the language of Callum's calculations the way she had taught herself stone. She had reached the final pages. She turned to the last one, and her breath stopped. It was not a calculation. It was a map of Kettle Creek. Every building marked with a small, precise rectangle, and around each rectangle, a second line, an outer wall, with the gap between the two carefully measured and annotated. Callum had not designed the plenum for one family. He had designed it for all of them. Every home could be modified, an outer wall of stone, a sealed air gap. The same principle applied across the entire settlement. He had died before he could show anyone, but he had left the notebooks. Bryony closed the book and held it against her chest, the way she had held it that first night by candlelight in despair. Except now there was no despair. Only the fierce, quiet pride of a woman who had carried her husband's legacy through fire and ice and come out the other side with it intact. That spring, a new kind of construction began in Kettle Creek, guided by Bryony, by the notebooks, by the principles of a dead stonemason who had seen what no one else could see. The townsfolk built outer walls, sealed air gaps, learned that 2 walls are warmer than 1. The widow's folly became the settlement's salvation. Bryony stood at the door of the plenum on a warm May evening, wind blowing gently across the prairie. Rowan was inside doing his lessons, writing in a notebook of his own, his handwriting already developing the angular precision of his father's. She placed her palm against the stone wall, felt its warmth. Sun, earth, still air trapped between 2 walls she had built with her own hands. The warmest coat, just as he had written. The coldest winds are not those that blow across the prairie. They are the winds of doubt, of convention, of a certainty that knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And the strongest shelters are not built of stone alone. They are built of resolve, of ingenuity, of the courage to believe in a truth that no one else can see. Bryony Ashwell believed, and the walls held.